So you want to learn the basics of No Limit Hold'em. Well, you have come to the right place because in this short video, I'm going to give you all the basics you need to get started playing so you're not a complete beginner. Well, maybe you'll be a beginner, but at least you won't be a complete donkey when you sit down at the poker table. So in part 1 of this video, let's cover the absolute bare essentials of what you need to know to play No Limit Hold'em. As you can see on this table, I have set it up for 6 max, which is the most common form of online poker. If you were playing 9 max, we would have to make a few adjustments, but the seatings are basically the same, the actions are the same, and the setup is exactly the same. So this is all you need to get you started playing this great and amazing game of No Limit Hold'em. First of all, there are 2 blinds always posted when you play No Limit Hold'em. You always have the small blind, and you always have the big blind. The small blind is right here, and the big blind is right here. The big blind is always twice as much as the small blind. So in this game we are playing $1, $2, No Limit Hold'em. The small blind posts half of the big blind, and the big blind posts the full big blind of $2. There are 4 phases of any poker hand. You have preflop, then you have the flop, then you have the turn, and then you have the river. Each one of those is its own exclusive betting round. So you have a preflop betting round, you have a flop betting round, you have a turn betting round, and you have a river betting round. Before the flop, the under the gun player will always act first. And to help you remember this, just remember that the big blind always acts last. Action always moves clockwise in a poker game. Under the gun is this player, hijack is this player, cutoff is this player, the button is this player, and the button is easy to remember because he has a button in front of him, and if you were playing a home game, the button would always be dealing the cards. The small blind is here, and the big blind is here. So when the dealer begins dealing, he will first give a card to the small blind, next give a card to the big blind, and follow suit all the way around the table. And once he goes around again and everybody has 2 cards, the action begins. The under the gun player has 3 choices on what he can do when he is first to act. He will either call by putting in the minimum bet of $2, raise by at least raising double the big blind, which would be $4, or he can simply fold if he does not like his cards, and all he does is push his cards into the middle of the table where the dealer will collect them. After he acts, the hijack once again have 3 actions that he can do. He can either call, he can bet, or he can fold. Now if somebody has bet in front of him, he can do something we call re-raise. And once again, he must raise at least the minimum raise. To keep things simple, just remember that you must always raise double what the initial raise was. So if this player raised 4, that is 2 more than the big blind, so you would at least have to raise to 6. But most people do not understand this concept, and they think that you have to double up whatever a prior bet was. Since it's very rare for someone to just do the minimum raise, typically you would raise to at least $8 should this player have raised to $4. Moving forward, if there has been a raise in front of you, you can either call that raise, you can either re-raise that raise, or you can either fold. So you always have 3 actions that you can do. Every player acts in turn all the way around until you get to the big blind, who is the last player to act. Let's just play through a hand to show you how this works. The under the gun player looks at his cards and decides, oops, I don't want to play, so I'm going to fold. The hijack player looks at his cards and says, nope, no thank you, I don't like my cards. Well, the cutoff, let's just say we can see his cards, which is king, queen suited. That's an attractive hand, so he decides to play those cards. So what he does is he raises, and look, he doubled up the big blind's bet. Now you can raise more than that. This is No Limit Hold'em. You can raise anywhere from $4 all the way up to your full $60.40. Whatever's in your stack you can raise to. But typically people raise anywhere between 2 and 4 times the big blind. Nowadays the typical raise is somewhere around 2 to 3 big blinds. Once he raises, now the button has 3 options. He can either fold, or he can call, or he can re-raise to at least, what is it? $6. So let's see what the button decides to do. Oops, his cards suck, so he throws them in the muck. So now we have the small blind. Well, he decides that he wants to call. Now he could have folded, or he could have re-raised, but he decides just to call. And the big blind decides to come along as well, so he calls. So we have a three-way pot. If the big blind had folded, we would have a heads-up pot. Now, all the money is pushed directly into the middle of the pot, and as you can see, the $4 here, plus the $4 here, plus the $4 here, makes $12. So we have a $12 pot going to the next street of poker, or the next betting round, which is the flop. And the dealer will shove 3 cards into the middle, and we will start again. Now, after the flop comes down, and for the duration of the rest of the hand, in the beginning of each betting round, the same player will always act first, and that is the small blind should he be involved in the pot. And then it just continues around clockwise all the way till the button. You need to remember that the button always acts last. If you can just remember that the button always acts last, you will always know who acts first, because if we are starting in a clockwise fashion and everybody gets a turn to act, then it would only make sense that the small blind would have to act first. So that is what we have in this case. So the first person to act in this hand would be the small blind, followed by the big blind, and lastly we would have the cutoff act. So let's see what happens. The small blind has 2 options. Well, actually technically he has 3, but we would never want to fold our hand because you never know, it might check through and we would pick up a hand on the turn. So while you are technically allowed to fold when there is no bet in front of you or no bet has been made, it is never, in my opinion, a good idea to open fold your hand. So let's take that play off the table. So technically there is actually only 2 options when you are first to act on the flop. You can either bet or you can check. Checking means you just don't put any money in the pot and you are checking to see what other people do. That's where the terminology comes from. So let's see what the small blind decides to do. He checks. And the big blind, once again, has 2 options. There has been no betting done in front of him, so he will check. So once they both check, we have the cutoff player, who once again has 2 options. He can either bet or he can check. If he checks, that would close the round and we would go on to the turn. If he bets, it would then proceed to the next player again, who is the small blind, and he would again have an option. He can either raise, or we call it re-raise, or he could call, or he could fold. So when no actions have occurred, you have 2 options. When an action has occurred, you always have 3 options. So as you can see, this game actually is not too difficult since you never have more than 3 options to make. So our player on the cutoff, he decides to bet $10 into $12. Now this is No Limit Holdem, so you can bet any amount you want from the minimum big blind bet of $2 all the way up to your full stack size. Most players do bet somewhere between half pot and full pot. Often you will see players also bet as small as third pot. So your typical bet size on any street will typically be, when the pot happens to be $12, would be anywhere between $3 and $12. Our cutoff player here decides to bet on the larger side, so he bets $10 into $12. Now once again we have the small blind who is next to act, and he can either call, re-raise, or fold. Let's see what the small blind decides to do. Well, he decides to call, and then it moves on to the big blind, who once again can either call, re-raise, or fold. He decides to fold. He doesn't like his hand anymore, so the money all moves into the pot again, and the next betting round continues. Because if the last action is a call, and there are no other players to act after that call, then we move on to the next betting round. If the last player raises, then the betting is reopened and everybody has to act again. So let's see what happens on the turn. We get a 3 of spades, and once again, the same player is always first to act. This is the small blind. And as always, the small blind has two choices to make. He can either check or he can bet. The player decides to check, and we move over once again to the cutoff, who will always have the last action. He decides to bet $16 into $32, which is exactly 50% or half of the pot. And once again, the small blind has three choices he can make. He can call and put in $16. He can re-raise and put in at least $32 because he has to double the size of the prior bet. So this player put in $16, so the small blind would have to raise to at least $32, but he could also shove his entire stack in. Just pick a number anywhere between double this bet and your full stack, and that's what you can do. If you decided to move all of your chips into the pot, you would just simply either move your chips in manually, or you would say all in, and the dealer will take care of it for you. The small blind decides to call this bet again, and once again, his call closes the betting round and the river begins. A 7 peels off, and once again, the small blind can check or bet. He decides to check, and the cutoff once again has two choices as well, and he decides to put the rest of his chips in by saying all in and putting his last $34.40 into a pot of 64, which is just over half the pot. Now the small blind has two choices. He can fold or he can call the bet. And he does decide to call, and we see something called a showdown. The first person to show his cards would always be the same order as the betting. So the small blind would typically show his cards, and then the cutoff could either decide to show his cards, or he could do something we call muck his cards, which is fold them face down and nobody gets to see what his cards are. Typically, the way you want to do it is if you are the cutoff in this spot and you do not have the winning hand, you want to keep your cards down and do not let anybody else have any information. If you have the winning hand, you turn your hand over and the pot will be slid your way. And that is what happens in this case. He shows his cards and he wins $132.80. So let's briefly review. In a game of No Limit Holdem, there are always 4 betting rounds. Unless, of course, everyone folds except for one player in a betting round, and in that case there would not be 4 rounds. It could end preflop. If the cutoff had raised and everybody had folded, he would just win whatever was in the pot at that moment, which would be the 2 blinds, and he would have won $3 and we would move on to the next hand. So the only time that we move to another street of poker is when 2 or more players are involved and there has been either a check and a check, or a bet and a call, or a bet and a re-raise and a call, or a bet and a re-raise and a re-re-raise and a call, or a bet and a re-raise and a re-re-raise and a re-re-re-raise and a call. You get the idea. So at the beginning of any poker hand, every player has his or her 2 cards in front of them, and they each in turn get to make a decision. Now before the flop or pre-flop, the under the gun player is always the first person to act. And the big blind is always the last person to act. Each player will make a decision on whether they want to either raise or fold. Once somebody has already raised, then you have the decision to either call, re-raise, or fold. So let's just briefly review by playing this handout one more time just to make sure you've got it.
The under the gun player folds, the hijack can either fold or raise, but he folds. The cutoff can either fold or raise, but he raises. The button folds, the small blind calls, the big blind calls, and we get to the flop.
The first person to always act is the small blind, who is the player directly to the left of the button, who always, if he is involved in the hand, is the last player to act. If he is not in the hand, then we simply move seats to the right until we find a player who still has cards, and he would be the last person to act.
So, the small blind checks. The big blind checks, the cutoff bets, the small blind calls, and the big blind folds. We go now to the turn where we see a 3 of spades. Once again, the small blind acts first, he checks, the cutoff bets, and the small blind calls. We get to the river where we see a 7 of hearts, and the small blind acting first again. We'll check, and the cutoff will go all in for the last $34.40 in his stack. And the small blind calls.
So we see a showdown, and The cutoff wins with his top pair and king kicker and takes down the entire pot of 132.80 cents. So I hope that you can now confidently go out and play your first game of poker and know exactly what the hell is going on while you're doing it. Please be sure to check out my next video, which will cover basic strategy in poker. So when you go to play, you won't be a complete donkey. You might be a slight donkey, but at least you won't be a complete donkey. So thanks everybody for tuning in. Be sure to subscribe to my channel and help support what we do here.
You can't handle the truth!